Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'm Uncle Bob. If you've come here to feel informed, you're in the right place. If you came here to feel, I don't know, optimistic about the human condition, you are about to be severely disappointed. This deep dive is dedicated to the absolute worst kind of academic self-flagellation.
Yeah.
You know the kind. The required reading that's so obviously true it just makes you want to punch a wall out of sheer exhaustion. This is books I'll never read again. Today we are talking about Gaetano Mosca's The Myth of the Ruling Class. And by myth, I mean the highly organized, historically documented 400-page proof that an Italian man needed in the late 19th century to stand up and tell everyone that the rich guys are in charge. Why are the wealthy and powerful in charge? Spoiler alert, that somehow took 400 pages to deliver. Because they are the wealthy and powerful.
That aggressive weariness you're feeling is precisely the mood Mosca seems to instill in his readers. The commentary around his work suggests that it operates less like groundbreaking political science and more like a necessary evil. I mean, Mosca essentially spent his academic life formalizing the most depressing truth we all intuitively know.
And then what?
And then he immediately dedicated the rest of his career to fighting with his peers over who gets credit for noticing the obvious.
Oh, it's the ultimate academic brawl. It's like watching two hyper-intellectual philosophers fight over who first noticed that the emperor has no clothes, while at the same time issuing these detailed 70-page monographs meticulously describing the weave pattern of his invisible underwear.
So our mission today is to distill Mosca's core, and yes, staggeringly obvious insights about elites and political power. We want to liberate those insights from the dense academic fluff he used to obscure the simple, brutal truth.
We're seeking the cynical core.
And ignoring the footnotes.
I have my cynical core extraction kit ready. Let's jump right in. We begin with a thunderous revelation. Mosca's first law of the ruling class. Now, you need to prepare yourself for a concept so obvious it could have been written on a bathroom stall. The core principle is that all societies, whether they claim to be a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a democracy, are controlled by an organized minority, the political class.
Right, and that minority imposes its will on the disorganized majority, the masses.
Groundbreaking.
Well, to fully appreciate why this is considered a groundbreaking observation in its time, you have to understand where classical political theory was kind of stuck.
Yes, Aristotle. He was too busy classifying governments based on who ruled, one, few, or many, and, how well they ruled. For self-interest or common good, he was worried about the normative side of things, how it ought to be structured.
Exactly. And Mosca comes along and insists that these traditional classifications, they just focus on trivialities and appearances, not the essential characteristics of government.
The window dressing.
It's all window dressing. Whether you have a king or a parliament, that doesn't matter. The essential characteristic is the fact of minority rule. The government is always, and he's very clear on this, a special class of persons, a minority that is organized enough to seize and maintain control.
So a monarchy is just an organized minority with a very effective public relations campaign focused on one guy wearing a sparkly hat. And democracy is just an organized minority that runs a very expensive, very distracting signal event called the election to give the disorganized majority the illusion of choice.
And the scope of this law is universal. This ruling minority doesn't govern in isolation. The masses, the majority, they merely provide this special class with the means.
The means being?
Resources, labor, or just compliance, whether that's given voluntarily or, as he says, under duress. The ruling class relies entirely on the passive acceptance or, at best, the inefficient opposition of the majority.
So the masses are basically the perpetually confused, utterly exhausted, and deeply underpaid interns who handle the logistics for the organized sociopaths running the operation.
They
deliver the means, the ruling class provides the justification, and everyone goes home slightly poorer and a lot more annoyed.
This focus on organization is really the critical point. The minority rules because it is organized, it's coherent, it's centralized. Meanwhile, the majority is amorphous, dispersed, and focused on individual local concerns.
Right.
He uses the analogy. A disciplined platoon of 20 men can rout 1,000 disorganized citizens every single time. That is his fundamental insight.
And what makes it so frustrating is that Mosca kind of admits it's not an earth-shaking discovery. He rushes to observe that mankind has intuitively always been aware of the fact that the few rule the many.
He even cites common phrases used across cultures, people always speaking of those on high who have their finger in the pie, who make the good and the bad weather.
It's folk wisdom.
It's pure folk wisdom, and this is the genius of the critique of his work. Mosca just translated that wisdom into Latinate sociological jargon to give it weight in academic circles.
So he could get published.
So he could get tenure. The intuition that they were the masters was always there in common life. But, as the source notes, academics needed a moment of societal crisis. Systems in transition, like post-unification Italy where democracy was on the rise, to formulate the tardy rationalizations of what common people already understood through lived experience.
He looked at the historical evidence and realized that every system, from the Roman Senate to the modern bureaucracy, was just a highly efficient mechanism for transferring wealth and power to a closed group.
It wasn't a discovery so much as a confirmation.
It was the ultimate soul-crushing confirmation of everyone's worst fears. I picture a young Gaetano Mosca. He's probably the kid who realized in the 5th grade that the student council president was only elected because Marco's 5 friends controlled the lunch money distribution, the best soccer ball, and the rumor mill.
Right.
It wasn't a discovery of political science. It was a devastating childhood trauma that he wrote a 400-page, highly formalized memoir about. Forever better that the popular kids weren't playing by the rules of the supposed playground democracy.
The bitterness is palpable in his early work, for sure.
He didn't discover gravity. He just developed a proprietary 12-step program for apples to fall faster, and now he charges $500 a seminar for the downward momentum optimization formula.
And he sues anyone who claims their apples fell first.
Of course he does. Buzz off, you silly goose. So let's look at the trickery they use to justify their powerful apples.
Okay, so to rule, the elite needs more than just brute force. They need justification, and they need some level of competency.
So what makes an elite an elite?
Mosca argued they have to possess assets which are at a social premium. Initially, these were very simple, being the best warrior or owning the biggest farm. Military skill, economic prowess.
Straightforward. If you can kill people efficiently, or you can pay people to kill people efficiently, you are in the organized minority. Simple.
But as society industrialized and became more complex, Mosca observed a really crucial shift. In modern times, the premium asset is increasingly managerial skills. And this reflects the complexity of the modern administrative state and the industrial economy. The elite must possess the administrative capacity to delegate, to coordinate, and to understand these vast interconnected systems. He also emphasized a moral or psychological component. The elite must possess a merit or a quality to which the group of which he is a part attributes great importance.
So they need to believe they deserve to rule.
And the masses need to be impressed by that perceived merit.
Okay, let's translate this truly. The elite are either genuinely good at the critical thing, the masses are terrible at complex financial maneuvering or bureaucratic organization, or they're just related to the guy who used to be good at the thing.
The advantage of positions already taken, yes.
Right. And now we have managerial skills, which means you can efficiently run a 90-person PowerPoint meeting about synergistic workflow optimization, you can delegate tasks without prying, and most importantly, you're not too honest about what's actually happening.
And here's where the human element comes in. Even as civilization promises equality, the old snob appeal has remained strong. In fact, it often grows stronger in an age of democratization.
Of course it does.
The source notes that critics in the early 20th century were worried about the frenzy of the new American pursuit of status. The more equality you promise, the harder people fight to prove they aren't equal.
The snob appeal is the engine of high-end anxiety. Everyone is theoretically equal, so you have to spend all your time proving, through expensive hobbies and conspicuous consumption, that your superiority isn't just accidental. No, it's managerial and it's hereditary.
It's about differentiation.
The organized minority must constantly differentiate its invisible underpants from the invisible underpants of everyone else. It must be exhausting, even for them.
However, skill alone is insufficient. The most vital trick, the magic trick used by the ruling class to secure acceptance and justify its power, is what Mosca called the political formula.
The great lie.
The great lie.
The concept I would tattoo on my forehead if I wasn't so afraid of commitment.
The formula is the attractive rationale, the ideology, the myth or abstract principle, it can be secular or supernatural, that represents or feigns popular consensus about what is just.
It's the moral wrapping paper.
It's the moral and intellectual wrapping paper around the material power, it says. We rule because we have authority, not just force. And the crucial cynical takeaway, the one that really defined Mosca's worldview, is that it is not the political formula which determines the formation of the ruling class, but on the contrary, the ruling class always adopts the formula most advantageous to its needs.
They don't change their power structure because they had a philosophical epiphany. They invent the philosophy to keep their power structure intact. It is pure strategic post hoc justification.
Exactly.
They're not saying we have all the money and the guns, so shut up. They're saying the ancient cosmic scroll of meritocracy dictated that we, specifically, should hold the yod keys because we possess an innate ability to select the most advantageous scroll.
It's about self-respect.
It's a semantic change designed not for your benefit, but to help their self-respect and to keep you from starting a riot.
Mosca was actually very precise about the nature of these formulas. He categorized them into rational versus irrational.
Okay.
Rational formulas suggest that the basis of power is expedient. So you might argue that majority decision is simply efficient for settling disputes.
Practical, boring. Fine, I get it.
But the irrational formulas, they claim that the majority is always right because it voices divine will or some kind of historical inevitability.
And that's where the danger is.
And this is where Mosca saw acute danger, especially in the rising democratic movements of his time. He worried intensely about the irrational turning the simple will of the people into something equivalent to divine will, which would grant it the total, unquestionable authority of absolute control.
That sounds genuinely terrifying. If the will of the people becomes a holy decree, you can't argue with it. You can't dissent, you can't lobby, you can't protest.
Why?
Because you're not arguing with the government. You're arguing with God or destiny or whatever organized minority is pretending to speak for them. This provides a horrifying rationale for totalitarianism.
Precisely. When the political formula claims ultimate moral purity, it justifies ultimate control. It gives the organized minority a terrifying tool for ideological domination that is far more thorough than mere military force. And this brings us to a critical theoretical anxiety for Mosca, the causal problem.
The chicken or the egg.
He was initially extremely anxious not to allow the myth, the intellectual or moral formula, to become the cause of change. He really insisted that organization and material power were the root factors.
Right. Power comes first, the lie comes second.
But the source material notes that later in his career, he had to grudgingly adopt St. Simon's view that moral, intellectual, and material forces, they just fuse.
The classic intellectual pivot. After years of hammering the point that power is the cause, the lie is the effect, he had to admit, wait, the lie is power now, and they've fused into one terrifying, highly organized blob.
He couldn't permit a myth to become the prime mover without reneging on his foundational conclusion. So the philosophical knot he tied to escape this was to argue that organization itself is an intellectual and moral feat.
Oh, that's clever.
It's an admission that ideas, once they're organized, they become a material force in themselves.
But whether it's a lie or a fusion, that organized minority still needs talent to manage that feat, especially as society gets more complex. I mean, it's one thing to invent the great lie. It's another to staff the administrative state required to manage it.
Yes.
If the top leader is just the face, who are the invisible, efficient gears keeping the engine running?
That brings us directly to the internal architecture of the ruling class. Mosca recognized that the ruling class is not a unified blob. It is stratified into two distinct layers.
Okay.
We have the first stratum, the very top leaders, the small group who claim legal sovereignty. These are the ones who make the headlines and the speeches.
The Dickard of sociopaths. Got it.
And then there's the truly essential layer, the second stratum. This is the much larger sublight, the operational elite of skills, administration, and goodwill.
So who are these people?
These are the functionaries, the bureaucrats, the academics, the mid-level military officers, and the educated legal class. And Mosca argues that the stability, and in fact the survival of any political organism, depends heavily on the level of morality, intelligence, and activity of this secondary layer.
So it's all on them.
If the subalite breaks up, if they become incompetent or disloyal, the entire regime collapses, even if the top leaders somehow remain in power. They are the operational core.
The top guys are the face, the idiots who sign the checks and get yelled at on cable news. The second stratum. That's the real operational elite. The legions of educated pencil pushers, the smart ones who keep the wheels turning, but are just slightly too boring or maybe too morally constrained to be the absolute top dogs.
Right.
They're the support team for the sociopaths doing the complex math so the sociopaths can continue doing sociopathic things efficiently and, legally.
And crucially, these public functionaries are often recruited from the people. They are the talent that filters up. And while they remain somewhat susceptible to old, popular influences, their new environment as part of the governmental machine, it weakens those ties.
The system absorbs the talent it needs.
It does.
That's depressing. The second you get smart enough to fix the system, they put you on the payroll, give you an expense account, and weaken your ties to the people you swore to save. It's an internal absorption mechanism so efficient they barely even need to write the paychecks anymore. The thrill of power is the check.
This struggle for the absorption of talent leads directly into Mosca's identification of two competing, constant, and universal tendencies in elite selection.
And those are?
The aristocratic and the democratic. The aristocratic tendency is the innate human urge to stabilize social control and political power in the descendants. It's about holding on to privilege, what the French call the advantage of positions déjà prises.
The advantage of already having the spot.
Exactly. This is the force of heredity, of exclusion, of birthright.
So the rich kids, regardless of actual managerial skill, want to make sure their mediocre children inherit the managerial opportunities. Because who cares about merit when you have an organizational structure designed to accommodate your incompetence?
Exactly. Conversely, the democratic tendency is the drive for equal access for all to positions. It's selection based on personal merit, talent, or merit in a mature society.
So it's a real competition.
And this is driven by innate human sentiments for social justice and equality, coupled with the rising importance of technical and scientific elements that necessitate actual provable competence.
So you have the rich old guard trying to keep the doors locked, and the ambitious, smart, poor guys trying to kick the door down, demanding merit. It's a fundamental tension.
And Mosca had very strong, and we must stress, very reactionary views on this conflict. He argued that if all individuals could participate in the scramble on an equal footing, if you eliminated the checks and balances of heredity, the struggle would be intensified to the point of frenzy.
Frenzy. Oh no. Competence leads to frenzy.
A political system, in his view, needs some level of inherited stability to prevent perpetual chaos.
So the solution to preventing a collapse of social order is mandated high-quality nepotism. We must protect the mediocre rich kids from the aggressive competence of the poor, or the whole system collapses into a sweaty, hyper-competitive mess.
He then delivered his most famous, or perhaps infamous, zany jab concerning family and merit. He was so terrified of the democratic tendency running wild that I need to quote this directly for you.
Please do.
He said, in order to abolish privileges of birth entirely, it would be necessary to abolish the family, recognize a vagrant Venus, and drop humanity to the level of the lowest animalism.
Hold on. I need to fully unpack the glorious absurdity of this claim. So if we just let the smart, poor kids compete, if we allow true, unfettered meritocracy, society instantly turns into a hellscape of intense, frenzied competition.
Correct.
Where everyone is sleeping around and everyone is acting like a badger.
Wait. So the solution to inherited wealth is mandatory state-sponsored promiscuity and everyone acting like a badger.
To prevent the frenzy, yes. That appears to be his logic.
I've been arguing for meritocracy my whole life. But if the alternative is a vagrant Venus and dropping to the lowest animalism, is that really so bad? I mean, who hasn't looked at the current ruling class and thought, you know what? A little bit of lowest animalism might actually improve things.
I'm not sure he considered that possibility.
They're already acting like boars at a trough. Maybe they need a little more Venus. No, seriously. If we abolish the family and achieve lowest animalism, who pays the taxes? The badgers. Do the badgers take over the administrative state?
He does not specify the badger tax code, no.
And do they charge $500 a seminar for the downward momentum optimization formula for digging holes faster? I have to know policy implications of mandatory lowest animalism. Gotta catch my breath. It seems Mosca was a conservative, terrified of social chaos, dressed up as fair play.
He genuinely believed that unfettered competition would lead to a frenzy that would be detrimental to the collective. He wasn't joking.
I see that now. He sincerely argued that certain intellectual and moral qualities required the continuity of high social positions across generations just to develop fully. The balance, in his view, was to have systems where the aristocratic tendency kept things stable and the democratic tendency periodically refreshed the talent pool, thus ensuring the second stratum remained capable.
A grudging recruitment policy to prevent the guillotines from coming out. Excellent. Let's see how his theory holds up against the guillotine of history.
Okay, so Mosca attempts to validate his theory through extensive historical examples, But the critique suggests he often missed the larger social dynamic in favor of just proving his elite hypothesis.
Naturally.
Let's start with Athens, the supposed cradle of democracy.
Oh, Athens. The birthplace of democracy and the constant reminder that historical success requires slave labor and robbing your neighbors. Mosca must have hated it.
He claimed Athenian democracy was fundamentally an illusion. He insisted it was essentially a highly selected and carefully educated oligarchy.
Of course he did.
And despite the political concessions made by leaders like Pericles to the poor, the payments for jury duty, the subsidies for attending plays, Mosca saw only the organized minority at work.
How did he explain that then? The payments.
He explained that the social balance of the Periclean age, where the poorer classes were appeased without bankrupting the rich, was made possible entirely by economic and political imperialism. The Athenian proletarians, he said, were fed and employed at the expense of the Greek satellites united in the Delian League.
So the Athenian ruling class kept the poor happy by making sure they had someone else to rob. It wasn't about the philosophy of citizenship. It was about the successful export of oppression.
That was his argument.
The political formula was popular sovereignty, but the material reality was Delian League tribute. It's international trickle-down economics applied via naval power. The Athenian citizen population, even the poor ones, were effectively a paid elite, part of the organized minority controlling external resources.
But the critical flaw identified in Mosca's analysis, however, is his severe anti-democratic bias. The critique argues that Mosca looked at the corruption and inefficiency of democracy, decided it must be a myth, and thus proved that a myth is stronger than all evidence refuting it.
He already had his answer.
He had his answer before he opened the history book. He couldn't accept the genuine political innovations because he was already convinced of the iron law of minority rule.
He viewed the world through his cynical lens and only saw proof of his cynicism. Fair enough. Let's move to Rome, a place he loved because the corruption was so gloriously structured.
He admired Rome's success, which he rooted in its permanent revolution, the institutionalized struggle between the patrician and plebeian elites.
You institutionalized brawling.
Exactly. The system worked for centuries because the patricians made timely, if grudging, concessions to incorporate the plebeian elite, the out elite, before they could successfully overthrow the system.
Rome was just institutionalized brawling. They turned class warfare into a bureaucratic procedure, a system so refined they could manage conflict into a successful export business called the empire. And Mosca loved it because the conflict was contained within constitutional channels. He admired that you could track who was getting screwed on a ledger and who was being promoted to the second stratum.
This internal struggle led to the merger of the two elites into one stable senatorial aristocracy, but this eventually broke down due to the rise of military power and plutocracy.
Of course it did.
Mosca observed that the triumvirs figures like Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus were ultimately masters overall, not representative of any social force. They simply seized power because they controlled the material force of the legions and had enough money to buy loyalty.
It went from a structured merger designed to keep the elites happy, to the ultimate victory of the guy with the most swords and the best marketing team. That's a predictable career path in politics, honestly. When the structure collapses, the thug with the biggest stick wins.
And finally, we look at the French Revolution, which Mosca viewed as a monumental failure of the ruling class.
How so?
He argued the old regime fell due to a decadent elite that was stubborn and weak, utterly lacking the firmness and energy to survive. The aristocracy was, in his judgment, too stupid to absorb the new middle-class elite, the bourgeoisie.
Ah, the classic error. Terrible HR practices. The aristocratic elite was obsessed with noble idleness and conspicuous consumption, focusing on their status rather than their required managerial skills. So they refused to onboard the brilliant, wealthy bourgeoisie into their exclusive club.
This failure to incorporate new talent led to a complete systemic collapse, which was precipitated by a double-class defection.
A double defection.
The old feudal class deserted the king, and the upper-class bourgeoisie who had joined the aristocracy deserted its own bourgeois base, leaving the door wide open for radical change.
So the French Revolution was caused by bad HR, poor assimilation, and an elite who couldn't be bothered to manage their own privilege. They refused to staff the second stratum with necessary talent.
That was his take.
Then they get shocked when the angry middle manager uses a guillotine as a severance package for everyone. The sheer intellectual arrogance of an elite that loses control because they refuse to recruit talent, that's a deeply satisfying Mosca-esque observation.
Mosca's analysis here, however, did struggle slightly because his dualistic scheme, ruler versus ruled, it failed to fully account for the complex trialistic tension of the revolution. The government, a disunited ruling class, and the new, powerful social force of the working class and the radicalized bourgeoisie.
It got messy. He liked it when it was clean.
He preferred a clearer dichotomy.
Now we get to the core of Mosca's rage. His ferocious early contempt for parliamentary government, which he detailed in his work, Tearca de Governi. This is where his cynicism about modern politics truly finds its footing.
His early analysis was scathing. He argued that parliamentary rule was essentially a sham, a systematic lie rooted in a corrupt selection process.
Which leads to
the despotic rule of non-entities.
Tell us how the non-entities get elected. Give us the mechanism of decay.
He detailed the mechanism of negative selection. The representative, the candidate, is not chosen by the disorganized majority of voters, but has himself elected by them, or his organized friends do the work for him.
The machine.
Candidacy, he insisted, is always the work of an organized minority which inevitably forces its will upon the disorganized majority. The party machine pre-selects the puppets.
It's like a dating show where the audience is allowed to vote, but only after the producers have meticulously vetted and handpicked the 3 worst possible contestants based on their pliability, not their principles.
Right.
We don't choose our leaders. The cliques choose which leaders we get to vote for. The vast, disorganized majority only gets to legitimize the machine's choice.
And this inevitably resulted in a political class defined by overpowering mediocrity. Mediocrity of intellect, mediocrity of character.
Finally, someone says it out loud. The truly honest, valuable elements, the ones with actual talent and principle, they withdraw, or they remain inactive because the system selects for compliance, not genius.
They see the game is rigged.
They realize they can't win without selling their soul to the machine. And this leaves the field open to the rascals and intriguers. It's the political version of Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good. Bad politicians drive out good governance.
Mosca went further. He explained how the political machine ensures this mediocrity. It forces younger, potentially better elements to conform completely, ensuring that a major part of the moral and intellectual forces will find the doors of Parliament forever closed.
How?
To survive the primary, you must cater to the whims of the small, organized group of grand electors. You have to prioritize obedience over principle.
This is not governance. This is a talent show judged by drunks where the prize is being paid to be a figurehead for a machine you hate. You start with principles, and you end up catering to the whims of the tiny organized group that controls the funding. You're just a puppet for the rascals and intriguers, and the result is the glorious, despotic rule of non-entities. He saw this decay coming a mile away, and he was livid.
His contempt wasn't just reserved for the existing political class either. It extended particularly to the rising working class and their organizations. Mosca harbored significant paranoia about working-class leaders. He saw them led either by men honestly pursuing naive and dangerous utopias, or, more frequently, by swindlers devoid of all conscience who incite followers against the upper classes.
And they're ready to do what?
Ready to move from the ballot box to the barricades.
He saw every union organizer, every socialist activist, as a Bolshevik vampire ready to suck the moral fiber out of Italy. His fear of working-class agitation was so acute he was willing to condemn the whole representative system because some guy who wanted a 9-to-5 shift might be a swindler devoid of all conscience.
Whereas the existing elites were.
Never mind the organized minority of bankers and industrialists. They were just following the formula, I'm sure. They were saints.
He was particularly troubled because he saw the rise of working-class organizations as the new use of the unitary principle, popular sovereignty, in favor of what, to him, was merely a particular class interest. It wasn't the common good. It was simply one organized group vying for power against another.
And that would lead to chaos.
He saw the potential for dangerous chaos and societal disruption.
He feared the competition would lead to that frenzy we discussed earlier, resulting in the dreaded lowest animalism taking over the treasury. He was clearly a man who preferred predictable, organized oppression to chaotic, class-based revolution.
And yet, despite his lifelong execration of parliamentary democracy and his terrifying predictions of mediocrity and decay, the older Mosca performed a remarkable pivot.
When was this?
Particularly as he lived into the 1920s and faced the rapidly encroaching reality of rising fascism in Italy.
The classic realization that the devil, the slow, bloated, annoying mediocrity, might be preferable to the actual demon standing at your doorstep wearing a uniform and carrying a big stick.
He shifted his veer. He started arguing that the liberal system's value lay primarily in juridical defense, a system of checks and balances where power is diffused.
So, process.
This defense exists when law and public decrees prevail over the appetites of particular men, and property is protected. It was a grudging, pragmatic acceptance that although democracy was a lie, it was a necessary lie that provided essential safety mechanisms.
He spent 30 years calling democracy a catastrophic lie perpetrated by morons. And then he was like, you know what? It's not totally a disaster. It prevents worse disasters like the ones where someone torches my villa and cancels my pension.
It is the definition of setting the bar on the floor.
Absolutely. The system isn't good. It just prevents something catastrophically worse.
He realized that no system is free from human moral blemishes and intellectual shortcomings. But the parliamentary system was acceptable because it made it incredibly difficult for one single political force to gain absolute preponderance.
Which leads to despotism.
Which leads inevitably to despotism. And he argued this applies whether that despotism is based upon divine right or a despotism based ostensibly on popular sovereignty. The concentration of power is the danger, regardless of the formula used to justify it.
So the key to juridical defense isn't some elegant political theory or separation of powers like Montesquieu talked about. Just making sure all the powerful cliques hate each other enough to stop one guy from winning.
In a sense, yes. The checking institution must represent a political force, itself powerful and organized enough to resist control. He realized the value of a system that permits a small, independent minority to persist and participate in public discussion. He called that discussion the real juridical safeguard.
It took the concrete threat of totalitarianism, a truly single organized force seizing the monopoly of both power and the formula, to make him appreciate a mediocre congressman who was at least checked by a messy, inefficient Senate.
It was the ultimate journey of a committed pessimist finding the silver lining in inefficiency.
The irony doesn't stop there.
Yep.
This entire colossal intellectual project was constantly overshadowed by academic pettiness.
The war with Pareto.
Yes.
Vilfredo Pareto, the other ancient Italian professor who noticed the rich people were in charge. Mosca vehemently asserted precedence over Pareto, claiming to be the first to enunciate the elite doctrine, initially back in 1884.
Two ancient Italian professors, Gaetano and Vilfredo, spending their twilight years fighting over who first said, "The rich guys run the show." This is the highest form of academic absurdity. I love it.
Mosca accused Pareto of plagiarism, of literary theft, claiming Pareto's earlier writings were purely liberal and democratic before he suddenly stole Mosca's insight about the ruling class.
He went public with this.
He published a short polemic, a pamphlet, essentially a nerd burner, to prove his rival stole the idea. Pareto, in turn, offered only a grudging recognition that didn't fully satisfy Mosca's ego.
Meanwhile, the actual ruling class is probably reading neither of them, having a great laugh, and adopting the political formula that justifies their current golf game, while those two old men squabble over who invented the blueprint for organized oppression.
It illustrates how even the most groundbreaking social analysis gets hijacked by personal ego and professional pettiness.
The very human failings his own theory sought to rationalize.
It's the ultimate example of the struggle for preeminence, even within the elite of social scientists. So, to summarize Mosca's cynical but potent legacy, despite his flaws, his contradictions, and his lifelong battle against his own democratic instincts, the myth of the ruling class is that they are superior or divinely chosen.
But the reality is,
The reality is that they're an organized minority that maintains power by adopting a useful political formula, the Great Lie, and managing the struggle between aristocratic stability and the democratic need for talent. The entire system hinges on the competence of the second stratum.
he spent his life worrying that if everyone was treated equally, they'd turn into a bunch of depraved, non-tax-paying badgers running wild. Then he realized that the slow, bloated bureaucracy of the despotic rule of non-entities, the mediocre congressman, was actually the optimal check against the actual tyrant who abolishes law entirely.
He learned to appreciate the value of a predictable, if inefficient, organized minority.
That's quite a journey.
And this brings us back to his deepest, most timely anxiety. Mosca's entire system was built on the necessity of a balance of social forces, or pluralism, to maintain freedom and juridical defense. He was horrified by the possibility of the fusion of power, the ultimate organizational collapse.
What did he mean by that?
He explicitly wrote about the terrifying prospect of a world where the monopoly of wealth and the monopoly of political power become one, If the second stratum, the technical, managerial, and scientific class, fuses completely with the first stratum, the resulting system would be, and I'm quoting, more powerful oligarchy, a more all-embracing racket in the original Camorra, than has ever been seen in a society of advanced civilization.
The ultimate syndicate.
Hmm.
Not run by the old visible plutocrats, but by the new elite, the new clerks, the managers, the hyper-competent technocrats who control everything from the top down and the bottom up.
Right.
They write the code, they run the logistics, they control the data, and they hold the yacht keys. They are the organized minority, armed with managerial skills and the political formula of expertise.
So you, the listener, who is now well informed about the iron law of minority rule, have to ask yourself, are the current masters just the rascals and intriguers Mosca complained about, perpetually checked by internal brawling?
Or there's something else.
Or are they a fusion of all technical, managerial, and political forces, the ultimate, perfectly managed Camorra?
And what happens when the ruling class is so entirely deserved, so factually competent in their managerial skills that they are, in fact, the best people for the job of running the machine, that you can't even hate them anymore? The fear isn't that incompetence is ruling us. The fear is that absolute, organized, professional competence is ruling us, and it's now invisible and absolute. That's what you get to chew on. Happy pondering. Buzz off, you silly goose.